Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. This video is the latest in a series of videos intended to help knitters learning to design or modify their hand knits, as well as for knitters whose desire is to learn more about how knitting works. Each video in the series builds on the previous video. We started by understanding how to calculate the number of stitches and rows needed to knit a rectangle or tube with specific dimensions. Then we learned how and why that stitch count might need to change when adding a stitch pattern. Last time we looked at how to calculate the shaping rate for a project so we'd know how many increases or decreases would be needed and how frequently they would have to be worked. In this video, we'll look at options for maintaining an established stitch pattern while working increases and decreases. So let's get started. So we're going to start off by looking at how you increase while maintaining a stitch pattern. Now I have a flat swatch here that's worked in seed stitch. You might be working in the round. There are a variety of ways things might work out when you're working flat versus in the round. Frequently when you're working flat, you're going to be seaming the edges, and so that edge stitch will disappear, or you might be picking up stitches along that edge and then working perpendicularly in the other direction to work a button band or something like that. So this edge stitch won't end up being visible. Now, if these edge stitches are meant to be exposed, you might want to do something like a slipped selvage stitch. But regardless, when you're working flat, you are not maintaining the stitch pattern within these selvage stitches. It's going to be between these two selvage stitches. That's what you're maintaining in pattern. This is a very simple stitch pattern, so it's easy to kind of understand what's supposed to happen. This, in the US, we call this seed stitch. In the UK, they call this moss stitch. You're alternating a knit stitch with a purl stitch all the way across the row or the round and the next row or round. However the stitch on the needle is presenting, you work it the opposite way. So here we can see I've got this smooth knit stitch under the needle. So I would purl this because this is currently a knit. This looks like a purl, so I would knit that one, and that's how I would alternate it. When I'm adding a stitch, when I'm increasing, I'm going to work my selvage stitch, and then I'm going to work a make one increase. And there's three different ways you can do make one increases. You can do where you lift the running thread between stitches, work it so that it's twisted. You can do a twisted loop directly on the needle and then not worry about whether it's a knit or a purl until the next row. Or you can do a yarn over or a reverse yarn over. Again, not worrying about whether it's a knit or a purl. And then on the next row, work it in pattern. Again, so that you twist that yarn over and avoid a hole. Regardless, a make one increase just produces a new stitch between two stitches. You're not using a stitch below the needle that might disrupt the stitch pattern, and you're not having to increase within a stitch like you would for a knit front back. Let's just look at what we would do here. So I'm going to knit this stitch. Now again, this looks like a knit, so this is going to be purled, but I need to create a new stitch. So if you use the make one increase where I lift the running thread, I would lift that up and I would work this as a knit because the second one we know has to be a purl. So this one has to be a knit. If I do a twisted loop on the needle or a yarn over, I don't have to worry on this row about whether it needs to be a knit or a purl. I can just create my yarn over and then work the stitches as they need to be worked in this row, and that's my preference. So I'm ending this established pattern with a purl, and now it's time for another make one. So if I was going to do a make one on this side, I might do the reverse style of make one. Like if I had done a make one left at the beginning, I might do a make one right at the end, or vice versa to keep them mirrored. I'm going to just do a yarn over. I'm going to do a reverse yarn over at this edge to mirror the yarn over at the other edge, and then I'm going to end with my stockinette selvage stitch. And then on the next row, again, I'm going to maintain my stockinette selvage. This is the wrong side row, so I'm going to purl that first stitch. And again, now it's time that I can work my yarn over so that it twists and it's in pattern. And I can look at that second stitch. This appears as a knit, so I know that's going to be a purl. So I need to work this as a knit. So it's a twisted knit. So I look at my trailing leg, the leg that's furthest from the needle tip, and I work through that one in order to make it twist. And then I can work my purl stitch. And I can continue on in pattern. So I'm ending with a purl. And once again, I need to work the yarn over as a knit. And this time the trailing leg is hanging over the back of the needle because it's a mirror of the other one. So I have to work through the back in order to make it twist, because in order to make something twist, you have to work through the trailing leg. And then I maintain my selvage stitch in its stockinette, so purl on the wrong side. So that's what allows me to increase and stay in pattern. But this is, again, a very simple stitch pattern, so it's very easy to know, well, what's supposed to come before the existing stitch or what's supposed to come after the existing stitch. So let's look at how we would increase if we had a more complex stitch pattern. So let's look at a stitch pattern from this book, the Knit Stitch Pattern Handbook by Melissa Leitman. On page 36, she's got a pattern. It's fairly reversible. She's showing the right side and the wrong side, but this is the little chart for it. So this is showing one multiple, the number of stitches across, and one repeat. And so we want to visualize what this is going to look like and how we're going to do the increases. So what I did was I went into my charting software. I use Stitchmastery, but there are other products out there like Stitch Fiddle is another one. And I charted out the pattern. So the blue boundary shows what you saw in that book. This is the stitch pattern with one multiple across of 12 stitches and 8 rows long. And these yellow stitches represent the selvages. So these are stitches that are not being kept in pattern. And I mapped it out, so I did several going up. So let's say we were working with 14 stitches for a while, and now we need to increase between our selvage stitch and the second stitch in. How do we know what's supposed to come before that or what's supposed to come after that when all we have is what we see in our needles? Well, that's where the charting comes in. It's really helpful for me anyway, and I think probably for a lot of people, to be able to visually map out what's going to go on. So here is a chart where I've added a multiple before and after the original one that's in the boundaries, and then I've got all of the repeats coming up. So I've got a whole lot of the stitch pattern, and this is the original part where I want to be working with. So when I want to do an increase, I can kind of map out what I want to do. So let's say after I do one repeat of this, I want to start doing an increase. I want one stitch out, and then so maybe every 2 rows I want to do an increase. So I can see how that's going to work out and how that stitch needs to be worked. So I can ignore everything in here because these are not going to be worked. But I know how the pattern is going to grow out in this direction. And I would do the same thing over here, is I would look at what is supposed to be there, and I can tell what the new stitches are supposed to be, how they're supposed to be worked. And this part right here, I can ignore. In the charting software, you can eliminate those stitches so that you end up with something that looks like this. So these are all no stitch boxes. So if you were actually working from this chart, you'd work this first stitch here, and you just skip all of these boxes because there's nothing in there. They're just holding the place, so as the chart gets bigger, there's room for it. And then I'd work these 12, and then right here. So again, when I'm working on an increase row, I'd work the selvage stitch, and then I'd work this stitch as my increase stitch. But this just shows you the actual stitches. It doesn't show you the increase. So this is where I would take it a step further, and I would plan out what kind of increase I was going to do. So if I'm using the kind of make one increase where I'm lifting the running thread, this tells me I need to do a make one net increase, and this would tell me I needed to do a make one purl increase. But if you're doing something the way I normally do, like when I use a yarn over increase, then the chart would look something like this. And if you remember, I used a yarn over that leaned in one direction, and then at the end a reverse yarn over in the other. So those aren't knits or purls, those are just a yarn over, but I can tell on the next row when I work it so that it's twisted that I'm going to have to work it as a knit stitch or as a purl stitch. So this is what I find really helpful for planning out increases. And again, you can use graph paper. You don't have to do this on a computer. You could just draw this out on graph paper, or you can use Stitchmastery. There is a free demo version. There's also a product called, it's a website called Stitch Fiddle, and so there is a free version that you can use, and then there's a more advanced version with more advanced stitch patterns. But you don't have to use charting software. Like I said, you could use graph paper to do something like this. But it is really helpful, for me anyway, to start with the larger chart and then just eliminate the stitches that I'm not going to need so that I know how I'm going to be working the new stitches in order to maintain the stitch pattern. So let's say we want to decrease. So we've got 3 multiples of this stitch pattern and we've got the repeats all mapped out. We want to start decreasing after we worked one of the repeats. So we come over by the selvage, we maintain the selvage stitch, but we're going to get rid of that second stitch. And then so every right side row we're going to get rid of a stitch. So we just keep coming over like this. And so we can see what it is that we are eliminating. None of these stitches are going to be worked. And we would do the same thing over at this edge, is that we would eliminate the stitches that we don't need. So we're not going to do those. So these are the ones that are being maintained. So we can see that the stitches are maintained, but we're not seeing the actual decreases shown in here. When you are working in this kind of situation where you're decreasing and you're wanting to maintain the stitch pattern, there are 2 approaches to this. One is to make those decreases as invisible as possible, and the other is to make them very visible. In stockinette, it's very common to make them very visible. You'll see this line of stitches. So you'll see it in a hat crown as well, where you have these visible lines of decreases in each section. But in a situation like a sleeve or the body of a sweater where you're working, half of the stitches for the front and half for the back, and you have this visible seam line, whether there's an actual seam or not, you may want to maintain that stitch pattern all the way up to either the marker or the selvage stitch, especially if that selvage stitch is going to disappear. So what you want to do is work that decrease so that it maintains the stitch pattern, and so that it eliminates the stitch to the right, actually eliminates this one and maintains this one. So you would be working a purl decrease that leans to the right. If you were working a knit decrease, you again would do one that leans to the right. So the knit decrease that leans to the right is a knit 2 together, and the purl decrease that matches that is a purl 2 together. So you could make those decreases, indicate them as right-leaning decreases, whether it needs to be a purl or a knit, where over at this edge, you're going to want a left-leaning decrease. A left-leaning decrease, when you are working the 2 stitches together, the stitch on the right ends up on top. So you're eliminating this one on the left, and that's what we want to do here. We want to maintain that second stitch in, whether it's on the right or the left, and we want to eliminate the one that's actually right next to the selvage. So you're going to be using a left-leaning one on the left and a right-leaning one on the right, regardless of whether it needs to be a knit or a purl. And then, so it would look something like this. So you've got your purl 2 together or your knit 2 together on this edge to maintain the stitch pattern, and you've got an SSK or an SSP on this edge in order to maintain the stitch pattern and eliminate stitches. Now again, you may not actually want to do this. You might want a visible line decrease instead. In that case, what you would do is you would do left-leaning decreases on the right edge and right-leaning on the left edge, and you would always make them in stockinette. So this would be an SSK, and you'd knit the stitch above it. You just keep doing SSKs, and and working the stitch on the next row as a knit. On this side, you would be working as a knit 2 together, and again, keeping those as knits. So if you have a selvage stitch, that selvage stitch would be maintained in stockinette, and then that second stitch is also going to be a knit or knit decrease. And that will be a very visible line of decreases. Here's an actual example in the seed stitch where I've maintained my selvage stitch and I've worked my decreases as knit stitches. So you would see that visible line of decreases when that selvage stitch disappeared, or if you were working in the round and you didn't have a selvage stitch, you just had a marker right here. Again, the stitch that would be right next to the marker would be a knit decrease, like that. I am currently working on a sweater. It's worked bottom up flat in pieces, and you can see with the sleeve, I've got increases going on here, and I'm maintaining this stitch pattern. And then I have my underarm bind offs, and then I'm forming the sleeve cap. So I've got increases here, I've got some bind offs, and then I've got some decreases right here until I get up to the very top where I've got more bind offs. So let me show you how I charted that out, because I didn't do exactly all of the things that I just told you. So I've got my stitch pattern all worked out here, and then I have over here, I've marked my my increases, my make 1 increases. And I marked them as make 1s, and I didn't indicate if they're leaning right or left. I did those actually as yarn overs, and then I worked them on the following row, which was garter stitch on the edges, so I always knew I needed to knit those. And I didn't worry about directionality, I don't think either, because with this knit purl pattern, and it's along a seam line, nobody's going to be able to even see. It's really a hard stitch pattern to kind of read and notice those kinds of things. So you may not necessarily need to do any sort of directional increase in a situation like this, because it just might not be visible. So I've got my increases going up here, and you can see I kept the selvage stitch in yellow, and my selvage stitch is not in stockinette. It's actually in garter stitch. The pattern called for that, and I did some swatching, wasn't sure if I wanted to do that. I thought it was actually okay, so I maintained my selvage stitch in garter stitch. And then after I did my bind offs, I went back to that garter stitch selvage, and I kept it over here while I did my decreases. And this pattern did call for decreases going to the right and left. They didn't bother with whether it should be a knit or a purl, because again, the stitch pattern is so hard to read, you would never notice. And it's a little easier to just do them all as knits rather than trying to do some of them as knits and try to do some as purls. And to be honest, with a purl decrease, you can't see the directionality, because it's the legs of the stitch that determine the direction of a lean, and you cannot see the lean in a right side purl decrease. So this is the sleeve, and these are the decreases. You can't see those decreases. You're not meant to see them, but even then you can't tell if something should have been a purl when I did it as a knit. You just can't see it in this particular fabric. So it's not worth trying to maintain that kind of stitch pattern continuity in this case. But it's always up to you. If that would really drive you crazy to do a knit decrease when you know that stitch is supposed to be a purl, do a purl decrease. It's really up to you. But I just wanted to show you the variations on how you can interpret these suggestions about how to go about maintaining stitch pattern continuity while you're doing your shaping. In this video, I covered how to maintain shaping for knit purl patterns. In the next video, I'll talk about how to maintain stitch pattern continuity while shaping more complex stitch patterns like cables and lace. The playlist for this series can be found over here. I've included links to other playlists and videos that are related to this topic down in the video description, and you can find my series on options for hat crown shaping over there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.